I'm Merage Ghane. I currently serve as Director of Responsible AI at the Coalition for Health AI, but prior to this, I was a Principal Behavioral Designer at Ideas 42, which is a mission-focused nonprofit. And I led some of the machine learning and AI work in healthcare specifically. And then prior to that, I was doing research in computational neuroscience and computational psychiatry, specifically around this topic of decision making under uncertainty, both perceptual uncertainty when we don't know what something is, and outcome uncertainty when we don't know what's going to happen with something. And that's the context in which I'm coming at this problem. Prior to starting with Chai, I led a work group on fairness and bias in health AI to identify what are the industry consensus driven thoughts around what responsible AI principles and considerations should be in the context of fairness and bias in health AI. We have all sorts of other responsible AI principles as well as part of that responsible AI guide that we published.
There's a lot of big questions in the healthcare ecosystem today on adopting AI, building AI, oversight. I wanted to start off with what are some of the top concerns that you all are addressing through your work at Chai? And could you also break them down by stakeholder type? So there's concerns that will be more important to providers versus payers and health systems or administrators versus patients.
So at our core, Chai is a convener. So we bring together people from all over the health AI landscape. So we have almost 3,000 members, and they include payers, health systems. About 48% of them are startups, larger tech developing organizations, folks that are developing AI solutions in healthcare, but also AI solutions to manage solutions in healthcare. So it runs a broad range. We also are extending some of this to the life sciences and pharma sectors. I think our thought from the beginning is that none of this work should be done in silos. Ultimately, what a developer does at its core impacts how that implementation process will work and what providers have to deal with and health systems have to deal with, and vice versa, right? So the capabilities, the infrastructure that a health system has will impact what kind of a tool can be easily implemented into their workflows, into their processes from a developer perspective. So we recognize that conversations needed to be had in this multi-stakeholder way. That poses a lot of challenges also because the goals of each of these groups are somewhat different. Like we could say in healthcare, everyone's goal is to make sure that the patient is okay and that they're getting the care that they need and that everyone has access to care. But for us, but the reality is there are competing priorities always. And so it's important to recognize that. The other thing is that Chai is an industry-led group. So we didn't really ground ourselves in like we are regulators or we're standards development. Our job is to come together within the industry and say, how can we amplify innovation, move innovation forward faster, but also responsibly? And that's a desire that the field expressed. And with the regulatory landscape being so uncertain, I think it's important, especially in healthcare, to really think through like, how do we get products out there faster into the hands of the people who need them? But how do we make sure that patients are safe, providers aren't overburdened, that these processes can actually be integrated?
What are some of the key strategies or tactics and tools that you all are recommending or implementing for that?
I work closely with my program manager. We're member serving. So members will come to us and say, this is what we need, or these are the use cases we're really grappling with, or we have struggles with procurement and we don't know what to ask and how to ask it when we're vetting different solutions. Or we'll have developers come and say, this potential buyer is asking me for 20 pages of questions and this one's asking me for 5, and there isn't a lot of standardization. So some of the steps we've taken on the transparency side and on helping to standardize some of the information sharing and consuming part is we've designed a model card and just recently this morning announced the plans to start a model card registry. And so this would be a model card that is standardized like a nutrition label where everyone knows where to find what information. The content of that model card aligns with HTI1 requirements for tools that are being integrated into EHR health records and the level of transparency they need to have. The content of that model card aligns with those guidelines. That's one resource that we've developed, and there's a huge group of early adopters, both on the developer side, on the tech companies, as well as on the health system side, that want to be early adopters of this tool to use it in their procurement process to amplify transparency around health AI product development. So that's one. We also run a lot of work groups that focus on use case specific best practices for what do developers need to know to develop, I don't know, examples of use cases we've worked on thus far, like sepsis risk prediction or discharge note summarization. What does a developer need to know to be able to develop this kind of tool responsibly? And what does an implementer need to know to implement these tools and use them responsibly? And as an add-on to that, sort of a level deeper, is our testing and evaluation framework. So at each stage of this process, at the pre-implementation or post-implementation, what metrics and measures should we be looking at to ensure that tools are useful and usable, that they are effective, that they are fair, safe and secure, maintain privacy, et cetera. So that's just like one subset of the stuff that we do.
You mentioned testing and evaluating, and whether or not a AI solution is for healthcare, that happens. And so I'm curious maybe what some of the differences are that are specific to healthcare, but also very related to that, explainability and interpretability. You know, the cornerstones of AI governance, how is that different in healthcare? And how are you seeing that prioritized?
There's a really deep need for balance in this space, I think, because a big outcome that we care about is patient outcomes, right? Like, how is this actually impacting the real world outcomes that we care about, other than pre-deployment performance of the model or pre-deployment testing of data integrity and all of those things, which are super, super important. But at the end of the day, if health systems are investing so much time and resources into purchasing this model, maintaining it, monitoring it, et cetera, is it going to actually help patients or not? And I think that's where we've started dividing out. There's like the pre-implementation metrics and measures that are really important and will help with that initial procurement phase. But then there is also that post-deployment monitoring that really needs to happen, and that metrics need to be defined to look at what are real world patient outcomes. So I think that's a big healthcare specific need.
Related to the metrics, obviously there can be a variety related to everything from like revenue cycle to provider productivity to patient outcomes and quality and access. What do you see right now is an example of success in implementing AI and measurable kind of results from that, whatever they may be?
Yeah, I think so much of this depends on the use case, which is why we've taken a use case specific approach. So when one of the first steps in our kind of planning process is like, when you're developing an AI solution for healthcare, what is the problem you're trying to solve, and why might AI be a better way to solve that? So there are intrinsic measures of effectiveness, and then there are extrinsic measures of effectiveness. Like ambient scribe is a really good example of something that lots of people want to adopt. If the goal of ambient scribe is to increase provider time with the patient, that might be a more challenging end goal than to say, oh, it reduces their, like, what they call pajama time, or like the time that they're documenting notes. And the reason I say that is because time saved, we also have this access issue, right? We have patients who are waiting months, years, sometimes for an appointment with a specialist. And so if a provider is saving time, then potentially they have time to see more patients, not necessarily just spend more time with that one patient, right? So maybe that's not the best outcome for this particular situation. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna reiterate that when the conversation we had in the fall with UCLA about this specifically was that really it's also improving physician satisfaction, and there's this even impression, whether or not it's quantifiable by computer, there's an impression that time is saved and it's made things easier. That makes a lot of sense. Ambient AI is actually the use case that I see talked about the most, and I think it's where in the startup ecosystem, I've seen the most traction for AI solutions. I want to actually, instead of continuing with my questions, Thanos, Karas, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi there. There is so many initiatives out there, right? Everybody's doing their own thing. You have Duke, you have Mayo, you have physician, and I know that Duke and Mayo they're participating inside, but they're also doing their own. They're building their own frameworks. They're doing their own testing.
Yep.
You have
Yep.
physician groups that they have very strong AI capabilities. They're doing their own frameworks. And then you have EU, APAC, Singapore, Malaysia. It is just a wild, wild west out there. So who is bringing everything together? And if I am a digital health company that builds AI,
Yep.
an AI solution, who should I listen to?
Yeah, I believe that people should have the freedom to choose who they want to listen to. However, I think this is where Chai's role as a convener really comes in. So we bring together all of these folks, we gather resources, we do landscape analyses. We're even right now working with experts to map our responsible AI principles that were consensus defined, that were based on landscape analyses in the field, to map them onto existing industry standards like ISO standards, IEEE standards, like all of those things to show the broader ecosystem and where do these pieces connect. So if you abide by these, you're also covering these other pieces, these other clauses. So I think we could have done a better job of that starting out, but we learned very quickly, like this was a volunteer-led effort of a lot of organizations coming together, and still largely is. So anytime we have a new use case, we'll bring in folks that are developing solutions in that use case. We'll bring folks who are interested in implementing or are already implementing these use cases. And then we have a conversation around like, how are you using it? How are you monitoring it? What are you measuring? What is reasonable in this space, in this time right now? And really trying to then translate that and say, okay, here is a list of best practices based on what we know right now. And another effort we've put into place and should be going live with early next week is making all of our testing evaluation frameworks, putting all of those use case specific testing evaluation frameworks on GitHub, because we want to create an open source community. We want folks to be able to contribute to this because it is such a rapidly changing landscape. What we know now about what works as the best way to evaluate a tool may not be what is the best way 6 months from now. So this allows it to be a living document that anybody can contribute to. And then we discuss amongst experts and say, okay, does this make sense to update it at this stage? Is there enough evidence, et cetera? And we do that accordingly. We're focused right now on the US space, but of course, products are not just made for the US. So we are also having conversations at the global level to see where folks are at, Singapore included, EU included. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
There is so much activity out there, and my biggest concern is that consensus is the enemy of agility. Right. So when you have 3,000 members and everybody wants to put their own thing in there, and at the same time, everything changes on a daily basis,
Yeah,
that's going to be the biggest challenge. How do you remain agile? Not only as Chai, but
absolutely.
all these organizations that are trying to get this done. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so this is so true. This is something that we learned very early on. Like when we published a responsible AI guidance, it was a very ideal state. And many people came to us and said, this is not possible. I'm sorry. So we really switched, and that's like the benefit of being a startup and being in this space is we switched our strategy to serve our members. So now we're really focused on what are practical solutions. How do we create like playbooks that are useful for community health centers? How do we create playbooks that are useful for payers, et cetera?
So I want to dive a little deeper into what you both are talking about. And David Nicholson may agree with me on what I'm about to mention about benchmarking. That point you made, Thanos, about agility and consensus and that tension is so important, especially with all the uncertainty that we have in AI and the complexity of healthcare. What I regularly experience in the corporate social responsibility space is that while there's all these voluntary standards and best practices that get developed by consensus through industry coming together to agree on these things, there's then also the regulatory and financial incentives that behoove companies to then implement these best practices. And so there's this dynamic between the regulation, the industry consensus, and then I'm calling it incentives, but it could be investment, it could be some other funding mechanisms. And I think this process that you're going through at Chai, even though it's voluntary and startups may say similar things like, oh, consensus is slowing us down, over time, what I suspect will become more apparent is that companies will be looking at how they're implementing best practices or setting policy in comparison to peers in their space or part of Chai. And that's going to be an important driver of conformance. David, you are agreeing with me.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the we'll see where that tension between market and opportunity and that kind of alignment comes up against our better angels as we try to do some collaborative work together as a group. I think that's constantly a tension we're always fighting in health, and I think some of the other misalignments at the larger structural levels make it that much harder to know where's the best place to put your stake. Because just an inch or two one side of the line can make a big difference in terms of revenue, in terms of adoption, in terms of clinical veracity or clinical output or clinical results.
And the other thing I wanted to dig into a little bit is you mentioned international regulations, and obviously we're still in the very early days of AI regulation. And I'm just going to paint a broad stroke here, but the EU, is basically setting standards that other countries are looking towards, and they're taking this risk-based approach and really have a lot of requirements for high-risk industries like healthcare. And the US, well, we're in a chaotic, uncertain moment, but safe to say we're not being aggressive about setting regulation for AI, especially in healthcare. So it's a more commercial based approach. It seems to me and others that, at least globally, the trend will be towards the dropping a risk-based approach like the EU. Is that how you all are looking at it? What's your take? Because obviously the direction or the trend of regulations is going to inform your work.
We actually have a work group focused on risk classification for non-device, because I think FDA has regulatory sort of oversight over the device space and like software as medical device and all that. I think the feedback we're getting is that no matter what, health systems are adopting a risk-based approach. There are liabilities, but they don't have as much clarity on what should we be doing? Like how should we be approaching risks and harms and hazards and all that? So how do we develop something for non-FDA regulated AI products that meets the needs, isn't super complex and like high lift? Because again, practicality is like the core of this, right? We want something that is possible, but also doesn't rely so broadly on like these high level heuristics. Oh, if it's Gen AI, it's bad. And if it's predictive, it's good. That's also not super helpful of a risk heuristic to go into. And really not just how do you evaluate for risk and impact, but also what are the mitigation steps that need to be in place that are practical and achievable. in this space. So maybe something is low risk and you don't need to worry about it. Maybe it's moderate risk and you may need to employ some deeper transparency or make sure you engage relevant stakeholders beyond folks that maybe are on the legal side of the organization or something like that to make sure you're not breaking any laws, causing any problems. So I think taking that risk-based approach is probably going to be something we recommend. And that being said, there are like many risk-based frameworks that are out there already that folks are adopting. But I think being in the US, how do we keep innovation front and center? So how do we not stifle that and meet the needs of health systems and patients and in a way that's responsible?